In the heart of a quiet, sleepy town stood an old library, a building so ancient that ivy had traced green, leafy patterns all over its stone walls. A young girl named Paige loved this library more than any other place. She loved the smell of old paper and dried lavender, and the way the dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams that slanted through the tall, arched windows. Most of all, she loved the forgotten corners of the library, the places no one else seemed to visit. One rainy afternoon, while tracing the carvings on a dusty, forgotten bookshelf in the very back of the building, her fingers brushed against a small, hidden knot in the wood. Curious, she pressed it. There was a soft, low click, like a secret being unlocked, and the entire bookshelf swung inwards with a gentle groan, revealing a small, round door that hadn't been seen in 100 years. The door was made of a dark, smooth wood she didn't recognize, and it had a single, silver keyhole that seemed to hum with a quiet energy. Paige's heart beat a little faster, not with fear, but with the wonderful, thrumming excitement of discovery. This was a secret meant just for her. She had always believed the library held a special kind of magic, beyond just the stories on the pages, and now, here was the proof. She took a deep breath, turned the small, cold handle, and pulled the door open, ready for whatever adventure lay beyond. As Paige stepped through the doorway, she didn't find a dusty storeroom, but a place of pure wonder. She was standing in a vast, circular room lined with endless shelves of books, stretching up high into a domed ceiling where a soft, glowing orb pulsed like a gentle moon. The air itself was different here. It shimmered with floating, golden letters and smelled of vanilla, old leather, and the sweet scent of a coming rain. But the most magical thing was the sound. A soft, continuous, rustling whisper filled the entire room. It was the sound of 1,000 stories being told all at once. Paige realized with a gasp that the books weren't being read. They were whispering their own tales. She walked slowly, her footsteps silent on the moss-soft carpet, and ran her fingers along the spines of the books. As she touched one bound in green velvet, she heard the whisper of rustling leaves and epic journeys through enchanted forests. When she touched another, bound in deep blue leather with silver clasps, she heard the whisper of crashing waves, lost treasure, and adventures on the high seas. This was the Whispering Library, a place where stories were alive. They breathed and sighed and dreamt upon their shelves, waiting for a kind ear to listen. Cozy armchairs and soft, velvet cushions were tucked into little nooks between the shelves, each illuminated by a single, floating ball of warm light. It was the most peaceful, magical, and welcoming place Paige had ever seen, a sanctuary for stories and for those who loved them. Paige spent what felt like hours wandering through the magical aisles, listening to snippets of 1,000 different adventures. She heard tales of talking animals, of flying ships, of kingdoms made of candy, and of brave heroes who could talk to the wind. Each book had its own unique voice, its own gentle energy that hummed against her fingertips as she passed. It was a symphony of stories, a chorus of imagination that made her heart feel full and happy. But then, as she reached a quiet, secluded alcove, she noticed something was missing. The gentle hum and whisper of stories faded away, replaced by a profound and heavy silence. There, on a pedestal of its own, sat a single, large book. It was bound in grey, worn leather and had a cover with no title. Unlike all the others, it was completely silent. There was no whisper, no hum, no soft glow. When Paige reached out and touched its cover, it felt cold and sad, as if the story inside had fallen into a deep, dreamless sleep from which it couldn't wake. All the other books seemed to lean away from it, their whispers hushing as if out of respect for its sorrow. Paige felt a pang of deep sympathy for the silent book. A story that couldn't be told was the saddest thing she could imagine. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her heart, that this was why she had found the library. This book needed her help. With gentle hands, Paige lifted the heavy book from its pedestal and carried it over to one of the soft, velvet armchairs. She settled in, the book resting in her lap, and carefully opened its cover. The pages inside were not filled with words, but with beautiful, intricate illustrations. At least, they had been beautiful once. Now, they were faint and faded, like a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The colors were washed out, leaving behind only shades of gray, and the lines of the drawings were blurry and indistinct. As she looked closer, she could just make out the story. It was about a knight named Sir Gideon, whose armor was supposed to be as shiny as a mirror, and a dragon named Ember, whose scales were meant to shimmer like 1,000 emeralds. But in the pictures, the knight's armor was dull and tarnished, and the dragon looked small and pale. They weren't fighting, as you might expect. Instead, they stood far apart in a sad, grey forest, both looking lonely and afraid. The story felt weak, as if it had lost its belief in itself. A faint inscription at the bottom of the page read, "A story's heart is courage. When courage is lost, its colors fade." Paige knew then that the knight and the dragon had lost their bravery, and because of it, their world was disappearing. She had to find a way to remind them how to be brave, how to be friends, and how to bring their story back to life. When the soft, warm light faded, Paige found herself standing on a path of soft, grey moss. She was no longer in the cozy library, but in a forest, the very same one she had seen in the book's illustrations. But it was even sadder in person. The trees were tall and ancient, their branches twisted into sorrowful shapes, but their leaves were all shades of grey, like old photographs. The grass under her feet was the color of ash, and the flowers that drooped on their stems had no color at all, their petals like tissue paper. The air was heavy and still, and a thick, quiet mist clung to the ground, muffling all sound. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no rustling of leaves in the wind. The silence was the most noticeable thing. It was a deep, lonely silence that seemed to soak up any hope. Paige could feel the sadness of the place deep in her bones. This was what a world without courage looked like, grey, silent, and afraid. She looked down at her own cozy, burgundy-colored sweater, a single, warm spot of color in the monochrome landscape, and felt a little out of place, but also like a small beacon of hope. She knew that her journey here was important. Somewhere, in this silent, colorless wood, were a knight and a dragon who had forgotten how to be brave. And it was up to her to help them find their color again, and with it, the color of their entire world. Paige closed her eyes and held the book close to her heart. She thought about how it must feel to be a story that no one could hear. She pictured the shy knight and the timid dragon alone in their fading world. A strong feeling of determination washed over her. She wouldn't just read about their sadness. She would do something to help. She remembered an old tale her grandfather used to tell her about how the truest readers don't just read a story, they become a part of it. "I wish I could help them," she whispered softly to the silent book. "I wish I could go inside and tell them not to be afraid." As she spoke these words with all the kindness in her heart, a strange and wonderful thing began to happen. The pages of the book in her lap started to glow with a soft, inviting light. The light grew brighter and warmer, spreading from the book and enveloping her in a gentle, shimmering cocoon. The whispers of the other books in the library grew louder, swirling around her like a chorus of encouragement. It wasn't scary at all. It felt like being wrapped in the warmest, softest blanket. The world of the library began to fade away, replaced by the soft glow, and Paige felt a gentle, pulling sensation, as if she were drifting down a slow, peaceful river into a new and different place. Paige walked carefully down the mossy path, the silence of the forest broken only by the soft padding of her own footsteps. After a few minutes, she saw a figure sitting on a fallen log, his back to her. It was a knight, but not a very knightly looking one. His armor was not shiny and bright, but a dull, matte grey, with little spots of tarnish on the elbows and knees. His shoulders were slumped forward in a posture of deep sadness, and his helmet was resting on the log beside him. It was Sir Gideon. He was staring down at his own reflection in a still, grey puddle, his face etched with worry. Paige approached him softly, not wanting to startle him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice gentle. Sir Gideon jumped, startled, and quickly stood up, his hand fumbling for the hilt of his sword. But when he saw it was only a small girl in a cozy sweater, his alarm faded, replaced by a shy embarrassment. "Oh," he mumbled, looking down at his feet. "I'm sorry, I didn't hear you coming." His voice was quiet and full of doubt. "Are you, Sir Gideon?" Paige asked kindly. He nodded, still not quite meeting her eyes. "I was," he said sadly. "I don't feel very much like a knight anymore." He explained that a great fear had settled over the land, a fear so powerful it had drained the color from the world and the courage from his heart. Paige looked at the sad knight, and her heart went out to him. He didn't look like a hero who had lost his courage. He just looked like someone who was very lonely and needed a friend. She remembered that she had an apple in the pocket of her sweater, one she had saved from her lunch. It wasn't a magical apple, just a simple, red, and very real one. She pulled it out. In the grey, colorless world, the apple's bright red color was a startling and beautiful sight. It seemed to glow with a warmth and life that the forest had, long forgotten. "You must be hungry," she said, holding it out to him. "Here." Sir Gideon stared at the apple as if he had never seen such a thing. He looked from its bright, cheerful redness to Paige's kind, smiling face, and something in his worried eyes seemed to soften. He reached out with his gauntleted hand and took the apple very gently. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of a surprise and gratitude that went far beyond a simple piece of fruit. He took a small, hesitant bite. As he did, a tiny spark of rosy color, the same shade as the apple's skin, appeared on his cheek, like a faint blush. It was the first speck of color the knight had seen in a very long time. It was a small thing, a simple act of kindness, but it was a start. It was a tiny seed of courage being planted in a sad and faded heart. Feeling a little bit braver, Sir Gideon told Paige that the source of the fear was the dragon, Ember, who lived in a cave on the other side of the forest. "He has a terrible roar," the knight said, though his voice trembled a little less now. "It is the sound of his roar that keeps the world so frightened and grey." Paige thought for a moment. "Has he ever actually hurt anyone?" she asked. Sir Gideon frowned in thought. "Well, no," he admitted, "but the sound is so frightening. No one has ever dared to get close enough to find out." Paige, holding the memory of the silent book in her mind, had a feeling there was more to the story. "Will you take me to his cave?" she asked. "I don't," Think he's as scary as you think," bolstered by her quiet confidence and the warmth of the apple in his hand. Sir Gideon agreed. He led her through the silent grey trees, his posture a little straighter now. They finally arrived at a large, dark opening in a rocky cliffside. A heavy, sad silence seemed to pour from the cave's mouth. There were no scorched trees or piles of bones, none of the things you would expect to see outside a fearsome dragon's lair. There was only a deep, profound, and lonely quiet. Sir Gideon stopped at a safe distance, his hand resting on his sword. But Paige walked right up to the entrance, her little heart filled not with fear, but with an enormous sense of curiosity and compassion. "Hello," Paige called softly into the darkness of the cave. Her voice didn't echo. It was swallowed by the heavy silence within. "Is anyone in there?" There was a rustling sound from deep inside, and a low, rumbling noise. It wasn't a fierce roar, but a deep, trembling, and very frightened-sounding growl. Slowly, a shape began to emerge from the shadows. It was the dragon, Ember, but he was not the great and terrible beast of legend. He was actually quite small for a dragon, and his scales, which were meant to be a brilliant emerald green, were a pale, dusty, chalk grey color. He crept forward, his head low to the ground and his large, gentle eyes wide with fear. He looked at Sir Gideon and let out another low, shaky growl, but it was clear that he was more scared of the night than the night was of him. Paige's heart melted. This poor creature wasn't a monster. He was just a lonely, terrified dragon. She realized the truth in an instant. The terrible roar that Sir Gideon had heard was just Ember's frightened growling, a sound he made because he was trying to scare away the knight who he thought had come to hurt him. They were both just scared of each other, and their shared fear was what was draining the color from their world. "He's not going to hurt you," Paige said softly to Ember, her voice calm and soothing. Then she turned to the knight. "And he's not going to hurt you either." Sir Gideon, she decided to do the only thing she could think of to bridge the gap between them. She sat down on the floor of the cave, right between the frightened dragon and the nervous knight, and she began to tell them a story. It was a story her grandmother used to tell her about two unlikely friends, a little mouse and a big bear, who learned that even though they were very different, they both loved to watch the sunrise and eat sweet berries, and they became the best of friends. She told the story simply, with a quiet, gentle voice. As she spoke, both the knight and the dragon began to relax. Sir Gideon lowered his hand from his sword. Ember stopped his low growling and crept a little closer, his head tilted, listening to the sound of her voice. She wasn't just telling them a story, she was showing them one. A story about a brave and kind girl who wasn't afraid of a knight or a dragon, and who believed that they could be friends. In the safe, quiet space of her story, the two lonely creatures began to see each other not as a threat, but as someone who was, perhaps, just as lonely as they were. When Paige finished her story, the silence that followed was different. It was no longer a heavy, fearful silence, but a comfortable, peaceful one. Sir Gideon looked over at Ember, not at a monster, but at a shy creature. Ember looked back at Sir Gideon, not at a threat, but at a sad-looking person in clunky armor. Then Sir Gideon did something very brave. He held out the red apple that Paige had given him, offering it to the dragon. "Would you ... like some?" he asked, his voice still quiet, but steady now. Ember looked at the apple, the only spot of color in the entire world, and then at the knight's outstretched hand. He crept forward and, with a very gentle, careful movement of his snout, he took a tiny nibble from the apple. As he tasted its sweetness, a single, magical spark of color appeared on his pale, chalky scales. It was a perfect, tiny, shimmering scale of the most beautiful emerald green. At the same time, the rosy blush on Sir Gideon's cheek deepened and spread, and a single plate on his gauntlet began to gleam with the faintest hint of silver. A tiny bit of the world's color had returned, born not from a great battle, but from a small, shared act of kindness. That first spark of color was all it took. Seeing the shimmer of silver on his own armor, Sir Gideon felt a lifetime of doubt begin to melt away. He stood up, and this time, he stood up straight and tall, his shoulders back, just like a knight. Should he looked at Ember, and with a smile, he broke off another piece of the apple and ate it himself. As he did, the rest of his armor began to transform, the dull, tarnished gray brightening into a brilliant, shining silver that reflected the light from the cave entrance. Inspired by the knight's transformation, Ember, the little dragon, took another, bigger bite of the apple. The single green scale multiplied, spreading in a beautiful, shimmering wave across his whole body. His dusty, chalk-gray scales turned into a magnificent coat of the most brilliant emerald green, each one shining like a polished jewel. He lifted his head, no longer cowering, but looking curious and friendly. The great fear that had held the forest captive was broken, not by a sword, but by a shared snack. Sir Gideon was no longer a shy, sad man. He was a brave, shining knight, and Ember was no longer a timid, hidden creature. He was a beautiful, magnificent dragon. They had not defeated each other. They had saved each other, with a little help from a kind friend. As Sir Gideon's armor shone and Ember's scales shimmered, a wave of magical energy pulsed out from the cave, washing over the entire forest, and with it, the color returned. Outside the cave, the gray leaves on the trees instantly flushed with a vibrant, living green. The ashen grass became a soft, emerald carpet. The pale, drooping flowers lifted their heads and burst into a riot of color-deep blues, sunny yellows, and cheerful pinks. The silence was broken by the sound of 100 birds suddenly bursting into song, and the cheerful chattering of squirrels. The air, once heavy and cold, was now light and filled with the sweet scent of blossoms and damp earth. Paige, Sir Gideon, and Ember walked out of the cave together and looked around in wonder. The world was no longer a sad, faded photograph. It was a beautiful, living painting, more vibrant and more alive than ever before. The fear was gone, and in its place was a feeling of pure joy and harmony. The knight and the dragon, once enemies in a sad story, were now friends in a beautiful new world they had helped to create. And it was all because a little girl had been brave enough to step into their story and remind them that kindness is the greatest courage of all. As Paige stood there, admiring the colorful, happy forest, she felt a familiar, gentle, pulling sensation. The world of the storybook began to grow soft and hazy around the edges. It was time for her to go home. Sir Gideon and Ember looked at her, their eyes full of a gratitude that words could not express. They knew she was leaving, and they knew they would never forget her. "Thank you, sir," Gideon said, his voice now clear and strong. Ember let out a soft, happy rumble, a sound like a warm, purring thank you. Paige smiled, her heart full. "Just be brave," she said softly, "and be friends." As the world faded into a warm white light, she heard one last sound. It was the soft, rustling whisper of the book's pages, the sound she had first heard in the magical library. But it was no longer silent and sad. It was a warm, happy, and grateful whisper. A story that was now alive and full of color, eager to be shared. The book was thanking her for waking it from its long, gray sleep. It was a beautiful farewell, a promise that this story and the friendship within it would now live on forever. And so, Paige became the quiet hero of the Whispering Library, a true friend to the stories she loved. Now, it is your turn to become a hero in your own dreams. Close your eyes, let your own story begin, and sleep well. If you enjoyed our fable tonight, we hope you'll join us again. Please like and subscribe to Bedtimes Fable to help us share more gentle stories with the world. Sweet dreams.